Hey everyone. Ready for something pretty intense? Today we're going deep, really deep into the world of trauma. And get this, it's not just about how it messes with your head, it's about the body too.
Yeah, so often we think of trauma as this uh, purely psychological thing, right? But
Yeah.
the truth is, it leaves these deep, scars on our bodies as well.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're basing this deep dive on parts 4, 5, and 6 of The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk.
Now, Vanderkolk, he's like the expert in
Yeah.
trauma, right? In his book, Groundbreaking, it shows us just how trauma reshapes our brains, our bodies, everything.
Yeah.
But here's the core part. He doesn't just dwell on the problem. He also digs into ways to heal.
Which is what we're all about here. So to kick things off, let's jump into this thing called the polyvagal theory.
Oh, this is fascinating stuff. You familiar with it?
Honestly, not really. Lay it on me.
It's completely changed how we understand our reactions to stress and danger. Basically, our nervous systems, especially this thing called the vagus nerve, it's always scanning our environment. It's like, hey, am I safe here or am I about to be lunch?
Okay, so it's like our body's built-in alarm system. Always on, always watching. But it's got to be more than just fight or flight, right? I mean, there are times when you can't run, you can't fight.
You're right. Dr. Stephen Porges, he's the one who came up with this polyvagal theory, and he's identified three main states our nervous system can be in. First, we got the social engagement system. This one's driven by what we call the ventral vagal complex, and it's basically like the feeling of being safe and sound, connected to the world, the good stuff.
So like when you're just chilling with your best friends, feeling totally at ease, you're present, your heart's happy, you're breathing deep.
Exactly. But then, oh boy, when danger pops up, bam, your sympathetic nervous system jumps in and it's like time for fight or flight, baby.
Yeah.
Your heart goes crazy, your breath gets all shallow, and you're ready to rumble or run like hell.
Oh, I know that feeling. That time I almost got rear-ended on the freeway. Pure adrenaline. Okay, but you said there's a third state. Like what happens when you can't fight and you can't run?
All right, that's where the dorsal vagal complex comes in. Think of
Yeah.
it as your body hitting the emergency brakes. You know, that ancient survival instinct that kicks in when the threat is so massive, your only choice is to shut down. Like a deer in headlights, frozen.
Whoa, okay, so you're saying we do that too. Humans, I mean.
Absolutely. Vanderkolk, he tells this story of a woman named Uda who was in this horrible car accident. She didn't scream, she didn't fight, she just went numb. Like she wasn't even there anymore. Classic freeze response.
It's like in those movies where everything slows down, goes silent. Wait, but
Yeah.
here's the thing, it really freaks me out. This isn't just a, like, temporary glitch, is it?
Nope. This is where the long-term effects of trauma kick in. Trauma survivors, they can get stuck in these fight or flight or freeze states way after the danger is gone. Their nervous system is basically like a hyper-aware watchdog, always looking for threats, even when things are totally hill.
So they're living in this constant state of anxiety or shutdown, even when there's no real reason to be, like their body's holding on to the trauma even if their mind doesn't remember it.
You got it. And the science behind it is wild. So there's this other amazing trauma researcher, Dr. Ruth Lanius, and she used brain scans to study people with PTSD. And guess what she found?
I'm on the edge of my seat.
There was this lack of activity in specific areas of the brain, the parts that handle self-awareness.
Hold up, trauma can actually rewire our brain.
Oh yeah, Kolk, he calls these self-sensing areas the brain's mohawk of self-awareness, and when they're not working right, it throws off how we experience everything.
Okay, hold on, mohawk. That's a great visual. But why is that lack of activity in the mohawk? Why is that so important?
Because it means folks who've lived through trauma might have a hard time feeling connected to themselves, to their body, even their own feelings. They struggle with this thing called interoception, which is basically being able to sense what's happening inside, like feeling your heartbeat, your breath, hunger, or even those butterflies in your stomach when you're nervous.
So it's not just about being disconnected from everyone else, it's about being disconnected from yourself, too.
Exactly. And Kolk, he uses this analogy about penguins, right? These penguins, they migrate across this brutal, frozen wasteland. And he's like, man, if those penguins had better brains, they could have figured out an easier way to do this whole migration thing.
I love that because, we humans do the same thing. We get stuck in these patterns, these ways of being, even when they're not working anymore.
Yeah.
And if you can't even sense what's happening inside your own body, well, it's going to be that much harder to make different choices.
And that brings us to some of the more, subtle effects of trauma. Things like alexithymia and depersonalization.
Alexithymia. Now, there's a word I haven't heard before.
It means no words for feelings, literally. It's this condition where people struggle to identify and express their emotions.
Wow, I think I actually know someone like that. My aunt, She could never actually say, I'm sad, but any time I left, she would cry at the airport every time and blame it on the wind. Always the wind. It was so heartbreaking.
That is a perfect example of alexithymia.
Hmm.
And what's really interesting is that brain scans show reduced activity in those self-sensing areas, that mohawk in people with alexithymia. Really highlights how trauma can mess with our ability to understand our own feelings.
So then what about this depersonalization thing?
Depersonalization is a whole other level of disconnect. It's like you're outside your own body, watching yourself from a distance like, whoa, is that me? It could be terrifying.
Yeah, no kidding.
It can be scary, for sure. But it's important to remember that these responses, as freaky as they are just the body's way of dealing with a threat that feels way too big to handle.
So it's not a sign of weakness, it's survival mode.
Exactly. It's the body doing its best to protect itself. And this is where we see how trauma doesn't just hit our minds and feelings, it goes after the physical too. Kolk, he uses this really powerful phrase, the body as a battlefield.
Wow, the body as a battlefield. It's a powerful image. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? How trauma impacts us physically.
He talks about this woman, Sherry. She was an operating room nurse, and to feel alive, she would cut herself. And get this, she couldn't even identify everyday objects just by touch. This is that sensory shutdown we talked about. Like she was disconnecting from her own body.
That's intense and so sad. But I'm thinking about people who are really good at compartmentalizing, shutting off their emotions. Is that similar to this sensory shutdown thing?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we need to understand that emotions, you can't just make them vanish. When we don't process them, they get trapped in the body. And they can come out in all sorts of physical ways.
Yeah.
Migraines, chronic pain, even something like asthma.
Wait, asthma? For real?
Yeah, studies show that kids who have been through trauma, they have way higher rates of asthma compared to kids who haven't.
So something we think of as a purely physical condition could actually be rooted in trauma.
Exactly. And there's even a proven link between childhood abuse and autoimmune diseases like lupus. It's like after trauma, the body can literally turn against itself.
Wow, that's a lot to take in, almost like a betrayal from within.
In a way, it is. Trauma can really mess with the immune system, leaving the body vulnerable to all sorts of stuff.
So we've seen how trauma impacts the nervous system, the brain, the immune system. It's clear those early experiences, especially in childhood, they can have these huge ripple effects throughout life.
Totally. And that leads us to the impact of trauma on attachment and emotional development. Those early bonds we form, they set the stage for how we relate to others and navigate the world.
This is where attachment styles come in, right? Secure, insecure, all that.
Exactly. And there's this fascinating experiment called the strange situation. Have you heard of it?
No, but I'm all ears.
Okay, so they basically separated babies from their moms for a bit and then watched how they reacted when they were reunited. It was groundbreaking in terms of understanding different attachment styles.
So how did the different attachment styles look?
Well, securely attached babies, they were upset when mom left, of course, but they calmed down quickly when she came back. Insecurely attached babies, though, they showed all sorts of avoidant, anxious, or just plain disorganized responses.
I can see how those early patterns would stick with you.
They do. Kolk talks about this study at a children's clinic
Yeah.
where they found that kids who had been abused saw danger, like everywhere, even in innocent pictures. Their trauma had basically warped how they saw the world.
That's just heartbreaking. So their trauma was shaping their reality, even at such a young age.
It was. And then there's disorganized attachment, often caused by, a parent's own trauma or just not being tuned into their child's needs. And this can lead to lifelong struggles with relationships and even just regulating your own emotions. So yeah, the legacy of trauma, it plays out in all these ways.
We've covered a lot, and it's heavy stuff, but I feel like I'm starting to understand how trauma really works. It's not just mental or emotional, it's this whole body experience.
That's a great takeaway. And here's the thing. Even though trauma has this huge impact, healing is totally possible.
Okay, good, because I was about to ask, where do we go from here? How do we start to address these deep wounds and find a path to healing?
Well, that's what we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at some of the approaches to trauma therapy and how they can help us reclaim our bodies, our stories, our lives.
I'm ready. See you in part 2. Okay, so we just explored how trauma can leave us feeling totally disconnected, right? From ourselves, our emotions, even our own bodies.
And you brought up this great point about how we can get stuck in those survival patterns. even when they're not doing us any favors.
Oh, yeah, like those penguins just marching across that frozen wasteland year after year. Like, come on, guys. Maybe if you tuned into your bodies a bit more, felt that exhaustion, the cold, you might think, hey, there's got to be a better way.
Seriously. And it's the same for us humans. If we're not aware of what's happening inside, well, making different choices, it's tough. But before we jump into the healing stuff, let's talk more about how those early experiences, especially the ones that lead to disorganized attachment, how those can impact our adult relationships.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm still thinking about that story about Marilyn, the operating room nurse who, attacked her boyfriend in her sleep. Like, it was almost like her trauma was playing out in her relationships, even though she wasn't consciously aware of it.
Exactly. Remember that mohawk of self-awareness we talked about
Mhm.
and how trauma can mess with those areas of the brain? Well, Marilyn's story, it shows us how those disruptions can really affect our closest relationships. It's like her trauma created this distorted map of the world for her, one where danger was always right around the corner, especially with men.
So she wasn't just reacting to her current situation, she was reacting to her past trauma, too.
Exactly. And those maps, like Kolk says, they're often encoded in the emotional brain, which means they're really hard to change. Marilyn's story is such a powerful example of how those maps can play out in real life, leading to conflict, mistrust, even violence.
It makes sense, though, right? She was caught in this cycle, repeating the same patterns over and over.
And that's why it's so important to understand the power of the unconscious.
Yeah.
Trauma, it can show up in ways we don't even realize. It can drive our behavior, our perceptions, all without us knowing.
So it's not enough to just talk about the past. We need to help people feel safe in their bodies and safe in their relationships, too.
Absolutely. And that brings us to, like, one of the most crucial aspects of trauma therapy, reestablishing that sense of safety and connection.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, Kolk emphasizes this idea that therapy, it needs to address both the traumatic memories and that damaged sense of self that often comes from abuse and neglect. It's like a two-pronged approach. Healing the wounds of the past, but also building a solid foundation for a healthier future.
So it's not just about processing the trauma, it's about rebuilding that feeling of being whole. So what are some of the ways to do that? What actually helps people in this process?
There are a lot of approaches that can be really effective. One big one is reestablishing a sense of safety in the body. Things like mindful breathing, yoga, meditation, these can all be super helpful.
Hey, yoga, how does that help with trauma?
That's a great question. And
Yeah.
yeah, it might seem a little surprising, but yoga is amazing for regulating the nervous system. It teaches people how to calm down those fight or flight responses and reconnect with their bodies in a safe and grounded way.
I see. So instead of running from those anxious feelings, you learn to be with them, manage them.
Exactly. And there's a ton of research backing this up too. For example, studies have shown that yoga can actually reduce those classic PTSD symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance. It's not just about relaxation, it's about reclaiming your body, seeing it as a source of strength and stability. And remember when we talked about Stephen Porges and those rhythmic interactions? Well, yoga has a lot of rhythmic movement and breathing, which could be so soothing for the nervous system.
That's amazing. So we're not just talking about the trauma, we're talking about actually changing how our bodies react to stress.
Exactly. There are other approaches too, like somatic experiencing. This one was developed by Peter Levine, and it's all about releasing that trapped trauma energy we've been talking about. It
Yeah.
uses these gentle, body-based techniques.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. It's based on the idea that trauma can literally get stuck in the nervous system, right?
Right. And that stuck energy can show up as chronic pain, anxiety, all sorts of physical symptoms. So the somatic experiencing is about gently unsticking that energy, allowing for a more complete healing process.
So it's like gently guiding the body to release all that tension and fear it's been holding onto for years.
Exactly. And it's often done in a really subtle way. Small movements, gentle touch, focused awareness. It's not about reliving the trauma. It's about creating a safe space for the body to heal, to reconnect with its natural rhythms.
This makes a lot of sense. But what about those people who think focusing on the past is harmful? Like the whole just move on, forget about it approach.
Oh yeah, that's a common one.
Yeah.
And I get where they're coming from. But honestly, trauma doesn't work like that. Those memories, those experiences, they're stored in the body. And they'll keep impacting our lives until we address them, process them. Ignoring the past, it just keeps that cycle of suffering going.
It's like trying to outrun your shadow, it's always there.
Exactly. Facing the darkness, acknowledging the pain, that's what's essential for real healing.
So it's about finding that balance, acknowledging the without being consumed by it, right? Honoring the pain, but also embracing the possibility of growth and transformation.
Beautifully said. And that brings us to another crucial element of healing, reclaiming our sense of agency. Trauma can make us feel powerless, like we're at the mercy of our past experiences. But healing, it's about taking back the reins, getting control over our lives or choices.
So it's not about blaming ourselves for what happened. It's about recognizing we have the power to choose how we respond to it.
You got it. And therapy can be so empowering in this way. It can help us make sense of how trauma's impacted us, develop coping skills, and ultimately reclaim our sense of self and our ability to make choices that align with our values.
That's powerful stuff. But what about those people who say, trauma is just an excuse, that whole toughen up, get over it mentality? How do you respond to that?
Those responses, I think they often come from a place of not really understanding what trauma is, how deeply it can affect us. Trauma isn't a weakness, it's a wound. And like any wound, it needs time, care, the right treatment to heal. It's like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off.
Yeah.
Insensitive and totally useless.
Yeah, I agree. So we've talked about healing as an individual, reclaiming that sense of self and agency. But what about relationships? Can healthy relationships actually help us heal from trauma?
Absolutely. Secure, supportive relationships can be like this powerful buffer against the effects of trauma. They offer safety, validation, belonging. They can help us relearn trust, intimacy, connection, all that good stuff.
It's like having that safe haven, that secure base you can explore the world from, knowing you have someone you can count on.
That's such a great way to put it. And these relationships, they come in all forms, right? Friends, family, romantic partners, therapists. The key is finding people who really see you, hear you, accept you for who you are, all of it.
It's about feeling seen, heard, valued, even when things are tough.
Exactly. And that sense of connection, it can be so incredibly healing. It helps us regulate our emotions, calm our nervous system, rebuild trust in the world. It reminds us that we're not alone, that even when things are hard, there's love, support, the possibility of healing.
That's a beautiful message of hope. Even though this is some heavy stuff, I'm actually feeling pretty hopeful right now. Like all this knowledge, it's empowering me to take better care of myself and the people I care about.
That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
And there's so much more to explore when it comes to healing and recovery.
Okay, so what's next? What other tools and techniques can help us on this journey of healing?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into in the final part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at some cutting-edge therapies, the power of narrative, and how transformative connection can be.
Wow, can't wait. See you in part 3. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into the body keeps the score. We've covered a lot of ground, the science, the impact of trauma, and now, finally, healing.
And as we've seen, healing from trauma, it's not just about talking, right? It's about how those experiences, they get like woven into our bodies, our nervous system.
Right. It's about reclaiming that sense of safety, that feeling of being in control that trauma can just rip away from you. So let's get down to brass tacks here. What are the approaches to trauma therapy that actually work? What helps people get better?
Well, Kolk, he's all about a multifaceted approach, one that goes beyond just talking. Because as we've been saying, trauma, it's not just a story in your head. It's this visceral thing that lives in your body.
So treatment has to address both the psychological and the physical. Makes sense. But what does that actually look like?
One key thing is reestablishing that sense of safety, of control. And often that involves body-based practices like mindful breathing, yoga, meditation, that kind of thing.
I've been thinking about that since our last conversation, and it seems kind of counterintuitive. Like when I'm feeling stressed or anxious, my first instinct is to just distract myself. Scroll through my phone, whatever, just avoid those feelings.
I get it. It's a common reaction. But these practices, they teach us to actually turn toward those feelings, to notice them without judgment. It's about learning to regulate your nervous system, to calm those fight or flight responses and reconnect with your body in a safe way.
It's like instead of running from the storm, you learn to weather it.
Exactly. And the research backs this up too. Studies show that yoga, for instance, can seriously reduce those PTSD symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, even hypervigilance.
That's amazing. So it's not just about relaxing, it's about reclaiming your body as a source of strength.
Exactly. Oh, and there's another approach I wanted to mention, somatic experiencing. This one was developed by Peter Levine, and it's all about releasing that trapped trauma energy we talked about.
Mm.
It uses these gentle body-based techniques.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that, the idea that trauma gets stuck in the nervous system.
Right, and that can lead to chronic pain, anxiety, you name it. So somatic experiencing, it's about gently unsticking that energy, letting the body heal more completely.
So you're basically guiding the body to let go of all that tension, that fear that it's been holding on to, sometimes for years.
Yeah, and it's often done in a really subtle way. Small movements, gentle touch, paying close attention. It's not about reliving the trauma, it's about creating a safe space for the body to heal.
Okay, so we've talked about working with the physical and emotional parts of trauma, but then there's relationships. How do we start to rebuild trust, reconnect with people after those bonds have been damaged?
That's such a crucial question. And I think one of the most important things is creating that sense of safety and connection in the therapy room itself. Trauma often leads to this profound sense of isolation, distrust. So the therapists, they need to be really attuned, empathetic, non-judgmental. It's about earning the client's trust, building that space where they feel safe enough to open up.
It's like building a bridge, a safe passage from the darkness of trauma to the light of healing.
I love that. And as that trust grows, the therapist can help the client put the pieces of their story back together. They can create a narrative that makes sense of what happened and gives them back a sense of agency.
Like weaving a tapestry of their lives, right? Bringing those dark threads of trauma together with the brighter threads of healing and resilience.
Exactly. And speaking of resilience, I think it's important to remember there are many paths to healing. What works for one person might not work for another, and that's okay. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to trauma recovery.
So it's about finding what feels right, what feels safe and empowering for each individual.
Exactly. And that might involve therapy, body-based stuff, creative expression, connecting with nature, even social activism. The point is to explore different options, find what helps you feel more connected to yourself, to others, and to something bigger than yourself.
Listening to all of this, I keep thinking back to that question we asked our listeners. How can we be better at recognizing the signs of trauma in ourselves and in others?
It's such an important question because the more we understand trauma, the better we can support ourselves and the people around us.
Totally. So what are some things to watch out for?
Well, some common signs are having trouble regulating emotions, getting overwhelmed easily, struggling with sleep, concentration, maybe experiencing physical symptoms like chronic pain or digestive issues. But it's important to remember that trauma, it can look different for everyone. There's no one checklist.
So it's about paying attention to those subtle cues, those changes in behavior that might signal someone's struggling.
Right. And it's also about creating a culture of compassion and understanding. Too often, people dealing with the effects of trauma are met with judgment, dismissal. We need to change that. Trauma isn't a weakness, it's a wound. And like any wound, it needs time, care, the right support to heal.
Yeah, sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen with empathy and validate what someone's going through.
I couldn't agree more. And that brings us to that final piece of the healing puzzle, connection. Trauma isolates us, makes us feel alone, but connection reminds us that we're part of something bigger. It helps us regulate our emotions, soothe our nervous system, rebuild that trust in the world.
It reminds us that even when things are tough, there's still love, support, and the possibility of a brighter future.
Absolutely. And that's the message I really want our listeners to take away today. Healing from trauma, it's a journey. And it's not always easy, but it is possible. And there's help out there.
Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. I feel like I have this whole new understanding of trauma and just how resilient we humans can be.
It's been my pleasure.
Oh,
And to all our listeners, I encourage you to keep learning, seek out those resources that speak to you, and never, ever give up hope.
and to everyone listening, we're sending you strength and support on your own journeys of healing and wholeness.